maybe I'm a prisoner of the moment. And that might very well be the case. And if it is, I will 100% eat crow. It has nothing to do with disrespect for Oregon. It has everything to do with the respect I now have for Ohio State and the chip that has now been created for this team on their shoulder. Hello and welcome in. It's always college football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy, and we appreciate you being here. And we know that here in the holiday season with travel all over the place, we know that your schedule's probably a little hectic. Ours is as well. So we appreciate you taking a little time to spend a little time with us as we preview these quarterfinal matchups coming up here on the 31st and the 1st, as we want to kick off this 12-team playoff in emphatic fashion. The first round left a little to be desired as far as competitiveness, but at the same time, it was not that big of a surprise that the teams won the way they won, and the matchups that have now been created here in the second round should only increase the level of competitiveness that we see from this point forward. There's a lot to look forward to, and I know that there's been a ton of negativity around the playoff and who should have made it, who shouldn't have made it, who did this, who did that. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day. Win your games. Oh, well, this team's path is more difficult. Fair. You still got to win a national championship, and you're going to have to beat some good teams along the way. Whether it's in the second round, the third round, or the championship game, you're going to have to beat quality competition if you want to hoist the trophy at the very end. We always ask you to like, to rate, and to subscribe if you can. Really appreciate the support that you've shown the show this year. The numbers are up tremendously year over year, and we hope to finish as strong as we've started here in the 2024 calendar year. We will flip the page here pretty soon to 2025, and we know that we'll deliver for you in 2025 as well. But let's ring in the new year by celebrating some of the biggest matchups of the season. We'll kick things off on the 31st. This is a 7:30 Eastern time. Penn State and Boise State from Phoenix in the Fiesta Bowl. Now, for those of us that are new to us here at ACF, we like to go in chronological order. So if you're wondering why we're starting with Penn State Boise, it's purely because it's first. All right. Like I said, 7:30 Eastern time on ESPN. The line right now, Penn State is about an 11-point favorite. The total is around 52.5. These two teams have never played. So Boise and Penn State, they've never faced off. And we know that the winner will take on the winner of Notre Dame, Georgia in the semifinal down in Miami on January 9th. Penn State, this has been a very favorable destination for Penn State in the postseason. They are 7-0 all time at the Fiesta Bowl. That's the most wins without a loss by a team in a single bowl game all time. That includes a couple very notable victories, like back in 1986 season, 1987 game, when Penn State went on to win the national championship. But in order to win it, they had to beat Miami. They did there in the Fiesta Bowl. Tons of stories around that game, naturally. So a fun one to document. So basically, when they're out in the desert, it's been very fortuitous for the Nittany Lions. I actually was on the call for Penn State's win in the Fiesta Bowl a few years back. It was amazing. Saquon, Trace McSorley, those guys went off. It was awesome. So seen them there. Yep, there'll be plenty of Nittany Lion fans there in Glendale as things get underway. Boise, though, has had their fair share of positivity around this game as well. They are 3-0 in the Fiesta Bowl, including 2007 when they beat Oklahoma on the pass, pitch, and then the Statue of Liberty. Pretty amazing game, right? Right. But this is Boise's first time in the college football playoff. They've lost one game this year. That was against Oregon, who won the game with a walk-off field goal. Question number one, can Ashton Jeanty run wild? Now, the top matchup in this game shouldn't surprise many folks. You have the Heisman Trophy runner-up in Ashton Jeanty, the best running back in the country, going against one of the best front sevens in the country defensively. Just to put into perspective how good Ashton Jeanty's been this year, and I don't usually like to go down the stat rabbit hole, but you almost have to if you're going to chronicle just how ridiculous this season has been. Ashton Jeanty is fourth in total rushing yards in the season in FBS history with nearly 2,500. He has 132 rushing yards away from passing Barry Sanders in 1988 for the most in a season in FBS history. Now, there have been people that have kind of pushed back and said, well, Barry did it in this and Ashton did it here. Fair enough. Just so we are all on the same page. Barry did it in 11 games. His stats, if you were to include the bowl game, which they didn't include bowl stats in record books until 2002, he would have finished the season with 2,850 rushing yards and 42 rushing touchdowns in 12 games. That's how absurd Barry Sanders' season was, because in that bowl game, he had 5 rushing touchdowns and 222 yards. That was the 1988 Holiday Bowl. So, yes, I don't know if Ashton Jeanty, unless they get to the championship, will surpass his season-long total of 2,850, but maybe he can take a big step towards getting there with a great performance against Penn State. Here's the thing about Ashton Jeanty. You can feel like you've bottled him up to an extent, right? Like you watch him and hey, always averaging 4 yards a carry, always averaging 3.7 yards a carry. And then boom, one play and he's out the gate. He's got 5 rushing touchdowns of 70 plus yards this year. That's the most by an FBS player in a single season since LaDainian Tomlinson back in 99. The other thing about Ashton Jeanty is you want to watch Boise State and their offense and their run game. You want it to be poetry in motion. You want it to be because the offensive line is just mowing people off the ball. But that's not really what it is. The offensive line is pretty average, if I'm going to be completely honest. Ashton Jeanty just doesn't get tackled. The guy has forced more missed tackles than anyone in the country this year. He's recorded over 1,600 yards rushing after contact. That's the most by any player in a season in the last 10 years. Okay, so the guy just doesn't go down. And Penn State, it's going to be different because if you look at what they've gone against, this is Boise, they have not played against top-tier competition against the run. The average Boise State opponent this year has given up 172 rushing yards a game. That would be 96th in the country if you were to average them all up across the board. Actually, 8 of the 13 defenses that Boise's played, they actually ranked 92nd or worse against the run. So you think about it, you think, okay, well, Jeanty's amazing, but is it partially because the teams he's been playing against aren't very good getting opposing ball carriers to the ground? Well, we know Penn State is. They're top 10 in rushing yards per game allowed. They're one of the best in rushing touchdowns allowed this year. They're top 10 in basically most defensive categories involving the line of scrimmage. They give up about 104 yards a game. Only one player has gone over 100 rushing yards this year against Penn State, and that's Woody Marks, who went over 100, went for 111 in week 7 for USC. Keep an eye on Kobe King. He's the linebacker, number 41 for Penn State. He's going to have a big role in this game, and if he is basically responsible for tackling Jeanty, that'll be a really fun matchup to watch. Question number 2. And I know I spent a lot of time on that one, but that's the biggest story of the game. That's if Ashton Jeanty doesn't go off, it's going to be very difficult for Boise State to pull off the upset. Okay. Question 2. Can Penn State's backfield tandem continue to play at a really high level? Now, Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton, the only teammates to have 2,500 career rushing yards over the last 3 years. They're one of only 4 duos to have 800-plus rushing yards and 10 touchdowns this season. They're the only duo in the Big Ten, and they've really been good. I feel like Andy Kotelnicki and the offense from time to time does get a little cute from time to time. They get a little too aggressive, maybe a little bit too creative from time to time. But I just want to see with Penn State some bread and butter every once in a while too, and I feel like I've gotten that more and more as the season's gone along. You know, Singleton and Allen are going to get their touches. They're going to get their looks. And I would imagine because of the pass rush, more on that in a minute, they're going to try to maintain staying ahead of the 6, which means that Singleton and Allen are going to get a lot of touches on first and second down. The other thing I've seen with this group as well is that a lot of the receptions that Singleton and Allen have, they're really no different than toss sweeps. I mean, just flip it out to them in the flat, watch them run with it. But this time they're running against corners as opposed to linebackers, which is an advantage for the Penn State tandem in the backfield. They've played great down the stretch. Will they continue to play great here in the second round of the college football playoff? That is question 2. Question 3, can Boise State's pass rush apply some pressure? Now, they're second in sack rate at nearly 11% this year. That trails only Ole Miss. They have 51 sacks that they've registered. Once again, that's only trailing the Rebels of Ole Miss. Here is one thing of note, though. Boise is a little bit feast or famine when it comes to their pass rush. They get home with great regularity, but they also have a tendency to be overly aggressive, miss the sack after applying the pressure, and then boom, quarterback gets out and makes a play. They're allowing nearly 8 yards per attempt when getting pressure on the opposing quarterback this year. That is 129th in the FBS. So not only does Boise State's pass rush need to be disruptive, but when they get to Drew Aller, they better be able to finish the job, because if they can't, he can escape and make plays downfield. Question 4, how will Boise defend Tyler Warren? Now, Boise State, they've kind of had their hands full at times this year playing against opposing tight ends. Now, they give up only 21 receiving yards a game to tight ends. That's the fewest in the Mountain West and the 12th fewest in the FBS. So you're sitting there thinking to myself, well, all right, they've been pretty good defending the tight end this year. You would also push back and say they haven't seen a tight end anything like Tyler Warren. And then you would also look at some of the teams that they've played, and there haven't been a whole lot that have really featured the tight end this year. They've only defended 3 targets a game to the tight end position. That's the 6th fewest in the FBS. So it's not like teams have gone against Boise and said, hey, we got to get our tight end going. That hasn't really been the case. And then here's the other problem, is that when teams have looked in the direction of their tight end against Boise, they're completing 76% of their passes, which for Boise, that would rank them 126th in the FBS. So they've struggled against tight ends as far as efficiency. It's just teams haven't really relied on it the same way that Penn State will throughout the course of this ball game. Question number 5, can Boise State play complementary football? They're going to have to. Because if they become one-dimensional and it's all about Ashton Jeanty, that's a great recipe for success against some of the teams they've faced in the Mountain West. But if Penn State all of a sudden isn't missing tackles, if they are gap sound, if they're doing a great job at the second and third level, leveraging the football and forcing Ashton Jeanty to play in the confines of the box, then that means Maddox Madsen's going to have to rise to the occasion and be really efficient. Now, he's been good as far as his decision-making is concerned. He's got a 22-3 touchdown interception ratio. So he's done a great job of understanding how he fits into the offensive scheme. He's not going to try anything unnecessary. He's got better mobility than you realize, and he can kind of keep you honest. But he's going to be going against the defense that in their most recent outing, they picked off Kevin Jennings of SMU 3 times, took 2 back to the house. And while some of those interceptions, you're probably going to look at SMU and say, all right, that was kind of on SMU more so than it was a great play made by Penn State, they still were in the right place at the right time and applied the pressure on Jennings that forced him to make a couple bad decisions. The problem is when you're playing against Penn State, their pass rush can be relentless. And every quarterback that's playing against it knows, I got to get the ball out. I got to get the ball out fast. Because if I let Abdul Carter and Deni Dennis Sutton get off the edges, I'm in big, big trouble. So guys are getting rid of it really quickly. And as a result, they can't really attack Penn State downfield with a ton of consistency. Opposing quarterbacks are averaging just 6.3 air yards per attempt against the Nittany Lions this year. That's the fewest against any FBS team this season. So teams aren't really capable of holding up in protection long enough to take some shots downfield. And that might be what Maddox Madsen has to do to take some of the pressure off Ashton Jeanty and this Boise State rushing attack. And then question number 6, will Drew Aller have to push the ball down the field? Now, it's worth noting that he is not a guy that's going to take a ton of risks downfield. That's just not where he's been. Right now, he throws about 8% of his attempts travel 20 more yards downfield. That is 122nd out of 127. But when he does attempt those throws, he's been really solid. Really solid. He's completing 57% on throws that travel 20-plus yards downfield. Nobody has a higher completion percentage than Drew Aller on downfield throws. But throughout the course of the season, he's mostly been asked to kind of be a game manager. Don't make mistakes. Play clean, efficient football that will have them well positioned. The defense will flex. They'll make great plays, and they'll just wear you out by taking advantage of your mistakes, running the football, and being methodical with their offensive approach. So I think in this game, that's probably going to be the approach for Drew Aller as well. Don't want to take any unnecessary risks. Just kill them with 1,000 paper cuts, and let's just move about our business throughout the game. Trends in the game. Since the start of the 2022 season, James Franklin is 32-1 as favorites and 0-6 as underdogs. The good news is they're an 11-point favorite in this game. Now, as it relates to the spread, James Franklin's 3-19 straight up, 9-13 against the spread against top 10 teams. Now, this is only the second time that he's been favored over an AP top 10 team. They beat Utah as a 1-point favorite in last year's Rose Bowl, the 2022 season, the 2023 Rose Bowl. So I guess it would be 2 seasons ago. But you're catching my drift. For those that have been just pounding this narrative about James Franklin not being able to win games against top 10, it's accurate, but he has not ever had a team, with the exception of the game against Utah, that was favored to win those games. So would you like him to be a little better as an underdog? Perhaps. But guess what? He's not one in this situation. I'm taking Penn State. I think this game's going to be very convincing in favor of the Nittany Lions. I think it has a chance to be on the lower end of the scoring side. So if you're catching my drift there, but I expect Nittany Lions to win this game comfortably. I think they'll bottle up Ashton Jeanty. I think they'll make life a little bit difficult on Boise's defense. I think they will take advantage of a talent advantage on both lines of scrimmage. So I will take Penn State. I think they win this game going away. The college football playoff quarterfinal at the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. This is number 4 seeded Arizona State taking on the 5th seeded Texas Longhorns. This game will be 1 o'clock Eastern time on January 1st. This is going to be an awesome game. The line right now is Texas by about 13.5. The total is around 51.5. Now, Texas, Arizona State, only 2 times ever have they played. This will be the second time. Their first time was back in 2007. Texas won that game 52-34. And what's ironic about it is that Jamal Charles, Colt McCoy, all these amazing players on that team. Just, gosh, I can't remember. Can't believe it's been nearly 20 years since Colt McCoy and Jamal Charles played. It feels like yesterday, but I digress. 161 rushing yards for Jamal Charles, a couple touchdowns. This will be the 4th time the Peach Bowl will host a college football playoff game. And the good news for Texas is that the SEC has won each of the last 3. Georgia beat Ohio State in the 2022 season. LSU beat Oklahoma in 2019. And then Alabama beat Washington in 2016. So Atlanta has been a favorable destination for SEC teams for quite a while now. Texas trying to make it a clean sweep by going 4-0 in the CFP era at the Peach Bowl. Question number 1. Can the Texas rushing attack stay aggressive? Now, Texas, they won the game against Clemson by running the ball tremendously well. Now, they created a couple big plays in that game. Jaden Blue got loose a couple times, and they did lose Trey Wisner, who got a little banged up in the game, but all totals, 292 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns. Really an impressive performance along the line of scrimmage for the Texas Longhorns. And if you look at how things have gone as the season's gone along, in their last 4 games for Texas, their best rushing games this year have come in 3 of those 4. The one exception will be against Georgia in the SEC championship game. But you look at the performance against Kentucky, you look at the performance against Texas A&M, and then most recently the game against Clemson, they have been really, really solid running the football, in large part due to Trey Wisner. Trey Wisner has been kind of the star of the show, was against Texas A&M. But after he got banged up, Jaden Blue stepped right in, thought to yourself, all right, there'll be no drop-off whatsoever. Now, it appears that Trey Wisner could have come back in the game, but it just didn't really need to happen. Because after Clemson cut the lead to 7, Jaden Blue goes off for a 77-yard touchdown run. And those two became the 4th duo to rush for 100 yards in the same college football playoff game in their performance against Clemson. So we know that Texas with all the conversation that is centered around Quinn Ewers and his play and how much he needs to do and what all is wrong with the passing attack, that's fine. This is a run-first offense. So highlight that first and foremost before we move to the other tentacles of how Texas can really attack you. It's pretty dang impressive. Question number 2, and you can make a case this might be the most important question in the game. Can Texas bottle up Cam Skattebo, the outstanding running back for the Arizona State Sun Devils? He finished 5th in the Heisman Trophy voting for a reason. He's the first player to have 1,500 rush yards and 500 receiving yards in a season since 2016. He was the last Power 5 conference player to do that before Skattebo was Christian McCaffrey in 2015. So 1,500, 500 is pretty rare air. Skattebo doing it this year for the first time in quite a while. 9 years. I was surprised. I thought maybe that number was attainable, but Christian McCaffrey, he was obviously out of this world back in 2015 with Stanford. So it's rare to see that type of productivity through the air from running backs, but Skattebo can certainly do it. And just to put things into perspective with how good he's been this year, okay? These are just his rankings and some very important stats as it relates to running backs. We're not going to go through the numbers. Well, he's got this, he's got that. Well, right now he's 2nd in missed tackles behind Ashton Jeanty. He's 3rd in yards after contact behind Ashton Jeanty and Jadarian Price. He is 5th in rushing yards total. He is 6th in rushing touchdowns. Now, the good thing about Skattebo, is that I think a lot of what Ashton Jeanty's done has kind of been as a result of his just spectacular skill. Skattebo doesn't have to do it all by himself. Like, their run scheme is really good. It's pretty advanced. They do a bunch of different things offensively in the run game, but his offensive line is also a very veteran group. This is a group that averages 320 pounds across the board. They have 129 career starts. These guys have played a lot of football, and they deserve an awful lot of credit for how they have impacted the identity of this team. They also need to account for Skattebo as a pass catcher, because if you look at Sam Leavitt and Skattebo, they're one of the best quarterback to running back combos in the FBS. They get a first down or a touchdown on 55% of their completions. You also, too, look at outside of Des Reed, the outstanding back for Pitt, Skattebo's kind of in a league of his own as far as what he can contribute in the passing game. He's really good on the option routes. He's really good in the flat. They'll find a million different ways to get him involved. And I would be really surprised if Cam Skattebo doesn't have 30 touches in this game. I think he's their best player. They're a little bit banged up at wide receiver. More on that here in just a moment. So he's going to have to carry a really heavy load. But the good news is he's been able to do that time and time again this year. Question number 3. Is Texas beginning to open up things in the passing game just a little bit? Now, we know that most of what Quinn Ewers does in this offense is within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. All right. A lot of that is going to be quick, short completions. They have very athletic and dynamic guys on the outside with the ball in their hands. So they want to get it to those guys in space and let them do work with it. 20 of Quinn's 24 passes against Clemson came with it 10 yards of the line of scrimmage, which is pretty ridiculous, right? But if you look, they're just a little bit further than they've been. He averaged about 7.2 air yards per attempt against Clemson. That's his 5th highest mark of the season. He's had 5 games here in the last 6 outings where that air yards per attempt has started to go up a little bit. So more and more aggressive in the back half of the season, and you would anticipate that only continuing as the level of defense that he'll face going forward continues to improve. There was only, a couple times where he tried it downfield. He hit one of those throws against Clemson. That was to Matthew Golden. And if they're going to try some throws downfield, it's really been Matthew Golden that's been on the receiving end. He has more receptions and touchdowns on deep throws than the rest of the team combined. So if they start to open it up, you would anticipate a slightly heavier load being put on the shoulders of Matthew Golden. Question number 4. Can Arizona State's passing attack get after some of the holes that might exist in the Texas secondary? Now, Sam Leavitt is really awesome, by the way. If you have not had a chance to watch Arizona State's offense. Skattebo's amazing. He gets all the credit. He gets all the hype, understandably so. But I think Sam Leavitt might be one of the most underrated players remaining in the college football playoff field. He's athletic. He's accurate. He's not afraid to take off and be involved in the run game. I think he's got better as the season's gone along with some of the touch passes that he's had to make down the stretch. So I'm really encouraged by his progress, and I'm really encouraged about how he can level up in a setting like this. Now, this passing attack suffered a pretty significant blow when their top wide receiver, Jordan Tyson, was out indefinitely prior to the Big 12 championship game. But in his absence, some other guys really stepped up. You saw Melquan Stovall go for 91 yards. In that game, he was averaging about 13 yards per game. You saw Malik McLean step up with 43 yards. You saw Xavier Guillory step up with 2 touchdowns in that game. Prior to the Big 12 title, Guillory had just 3 touchdowns on the season. So to have 2 in one game goes to show you that in the absence of Tyson, it does appear like Arizona State has some guys that can step up. Now, they haven't been asked to, because Tyson had such a significant workload in the first 12 games. But now in his absence, guys are going to have to go and take over. Because if you look at how things went for Texas against Clemson, Cade Klubnik had some opportunities. Now, they scored 24 points. They were the 3rd team this year to score 20-plus points against Texas. Georgia did it twice. And then Vanderbilt did it there. They did score late, so take it for what you will. But still, 24 points is 24 points. The thing that was even more eye-popping is the fact that Clemson was able to generate 412 yards of offense. And the Longhorns had not allowed more than 329 yards in the game this year. They had allowed just 4 passing touchdowns in the regular season. Cade Klubnik had 3. So I do think they have a really good safety play. Michael Taft, Andrew Makuba, those guys do a great job. I think Jahdae Barron on the outside's awesome. I think Manny Muhammad's really good as well. But like any great defense, they're going to force you to win one-on-ones on the outside. And if you can do that, you have a real chance of being able to move the ball through the air and generate some chunk yardage, because that's what Clemson did, but Clemson has elite wideouts. Does Arizona State? We will find out. Question number 5. With so many different options, can Arizona State slow down this Texas offense? Now, you give Steve Sarkisian time, and he's got plenty of it. I know the holiday season, people are traveling all over the place. I would imagine always with Steve Sarkisian, I imagine him sitting there at Christmas dinner and drawing up plays. I just think he's that good. He's that creative. He is so good when it comes to creating matchups, and he knows how to use specific motions to exploit some of the areas of your defense where you might become pretty vulnerable. And he's done it throughout the regular season too, but with extra time, those motions seemingly get more creative, and those matchups that are created get more favorable because they're going to motion on 56% of their snaps. I mean, it's one of the highest in the entire country. They ran motion on 60% of their snaps against Clemson. On those plays involving motion, they had 373 yards of offense and 5 touchdowns. So we know this is going to be a group that will absolutely utilize motion and create matchups as a result. And one of those matchups that becomes a huge problem is Gunner Helm. Gunner Helm's a tight end for the Texas Longhorns. He had a touchdown there at the end of the first half against Clemson. But he is really, really good and has become such an important piece of this offense on early down and distance. He's 6'5". He's 250 plus pounds, and he's now first in Longhorns history in catches by a tight end and second in yards and touchdowns by a tight end in the season. So he's had a terrific year and will take some of the pressure off Isaiah Bond, DeAndre Moore, Matthew Golden, all those incredible weapons that they have. And then Wisner, of course, as a running back involved in the passing game as well. So Arizona State's going to have to kind of pick their poison, because these motions and shifts, they're going to find matchups in Arizona State's secondary that will be a problem. So Arizona State's going to have to shift and adjust and make sure they're really smart with disguising their coverages, because if they're not, they have a chance to get chopped down pretty quickly. And then question number 6, can Arizona State force a few mistakes? Here's kind of where I'm at as it relates to evaluating this matchup. I think Texas, if they play a clean game, they're going to win the game. I think they'll win the game comfortably. But I also think that Texas has been a team this year that I don't trust that much when it comes to keeping the clean sheet offensively. They've turned it over 23 times this year. That is 122nd in college football. So they'll give it up and they'll let you take it. And Arizona State, so far this season, has been pretty opportunistic. They are plus 14 in turnover margin. That's among the best in all of college football. They have also forced 22 turnovers while only turning it over 8 times themselves. Here's the problem, though, as it relates to turning Texas over. If you're going to make Quinn Ewers throw it into traffic, if you're going to force him into making some bad decisions, you better have some guys up front along the defensive front that can cause some havoc, and that's not really where Arizona State excels. Now, the 2 games where he was most careless with the football were the 2 games against Georgia. And then I guess if you want to go a layer further, did have a couple of questionable decisions made against A&M. Now, those 2 teams, they have a relentless pass rush. Arizona State doesn't have that. That's a huge problem in this game. They generate pressure just 30% of the time. That is 109th in college football. And most of the time when they do generate pressure, it's because they've brought some blitz. So that's a problem. If Arizona State can't create a little bit of a pass rush, are you going to be able to put enough pressure on Quinn Ewers to force him to throw it into traffic? That's a question that I'm not sure we're going to get the answer to. Trends in the game. Double-digit favorites in the CFP are 9-0 outright and 7-2 against the spread. The biggest upset in the CFP era was when Ohio State, as a 9-point dog, beat Bama back in the 2014 semifinal. The good news is for Arizona State that they are 11-2 against the spread this season. So they've been one of the best teams in the country as far as covering the spread and making things interesting. I'll take Texas here. I think they're going to contain Arizona State. I'm expecting it to be kind of a lower scoring game, but I would not feel super comfortable about laying the points. Just saying, would not feel real good about laying 14 here or whatever it ends up being. I would not be surprised at all if Arizona State has kind of a backdoor cover type of situation. So be careful if you want to lay them, but I think Texas will punch their ticket to the semifinal. The college football playoff quarterfinal at the Rose Bowl game presented by Prudential. It's the number 1 seeded Oregon Ducks. Top team in the country, only undefeated team in the FBS, taking on the 8th seeded Ohio State Buckeyes. This game will be January 1st, 5 o'clock Eastern time, in its traditional spot on ABC. Ohio State right now is a 2.5-point favorite. The total is around 54.5. This is the 12th ever meeting between Ohio State and Oregon. The Buckeyes currently have a 9-2 series lead, but Oregon's won the last 2. So that's pretty encouraging. They won in 2021 in Columbus, and they, of course, won earlier this year in Eugene. This will be the fourth time these 2 teams have played in a postseason game. The last came in the 2015 national championship. That was when Ohio State beat Marcus Mariota and the Ducks 42-20 in Arlington, Texas. Now, the matchup earlier this year carries a lot of weight. It's the only matchup that we have here in the quarterfinals in which these 2 teams have played already. So much, by the way, for rematches and things like that. Rematches are looking a little unlikely based on how the bracket is all sorting itself out. But the matchup earlier, really, really interesting. The only top 3 game of the 2024 regular season, not including conference championships or anything like that. This is a game that had 7 lead changes, including 3 lead changes in the fourth quarter. Oregon took the lead with about a minute and 47 seconds remaining. Sappington hits a 19-yard field goal, but on the ensuing possession, Ohio State got all the way down to the 28-yard line before Jeremiah Smith was called for that offensive pass interference that kind of crushed Ohio State's drive that backed them up 15. And with 10 seconds left, Oregon used that illegal substitution penalty to take a little more time off the clock. And then with 6 seconds left, Will Howard scrambled, went down at the Oregon 26. They had a timeout left, but the clock expired before they could call the timeout. Game, set, match. Oregon survives 32-31. It was an amazing game. Going back and watching that game as I was preparing for this segment and preparing for the quarterfinal round, that was just a treat. what a treat. And I hope this one will deliver again. I'm sure it will, knowing how good these teams are playing heading into this matchup. Question number 1. Can Ohio State's offense continue to stay aggressive? Now, this is something that I really appreciated from Ryan Day and Chip Kelly in their most recent game against Tennessee, because that was one of the best defenses in the Southeastern Conference. They went out, they scored touchdowns on their first 3 drives. Tennessee had no answer whatsoever for Jeremiah Smith. Couple of touchdowns, had over 100 yards receiving. Volunteers also, they couldn't tackle any of the backs. I mean, Travion Henderson went for 134 yards, couple touchdowns. Will Howard was relentless, just pushing it downfield, perfect throw after perfect throw after perfect throw. There was no way to contain these wide receivers. Emeka Egbuka got open like crazy as well. But what I like most is it was an acknowledgement in the Michigan game. Ohio State played a little bit too conservatively and played a little bit too much towards trying to dominate the line of scrimmage. Because look, we know that Ohio State most of the time this year has been really good along the line of scrimmage defensively. But one area where they have struggled at times has been along their offensive line. That's been one area that's been challenging for Ohio State. They've had injuries. They lose their left tackle. They lose their center. They've had guys moving around different places, playing different spots. And as a result, the continuity and consistency hasn't been great. But there was a bit of a head scratcher watching the game against Michigan. Like, man, why did they revert so much attention towards trying to be balanced in the run game and kind of ignore going into attack mode against Michigan with their elite wide receivers? So Chip Kelly, Ryan Day, they said, forget about it. We're done trying to create balance. We'll create it, but we'll get to that in the second half of games. We're coming out. We're throwing haymakers. Our best position group on the field is at wide receiver. We're going to give those guys as many looks as they need to make an impact on the game. And boy, was it impressive. Now, like I said, once the passing game gets going, then you can lean into the run game. And that's exactly what they did. Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, they're still going to be hugely important into Ohio State's long-term success. And if you look at the game against Oregon the first time around, they were pretty good. All things considered, this is a great Oregon defense. Ohio State had 141 rushing yards total. They went over 4 yards per carry. That's also pretty good against a team like this. They had 4 carries that went for 10 plus yards. But here's part of the problem is that a lot of that rushing production came in the first quarter of that football game. The 53-yard run from Travion Henderson, first quarter. Now in quarters 2, 3, and 4, Ohio State had just 42 rushing yards and averaged 1.8 per carry. So they're going to have to be a whole lot better as the game goes along because they started fast on the ground, but it got away from them a little bit as the game went last time. Now they're going to have to sustain that success on the ground by balancing how many runs they get versus how many shots they take. And if they can hit some big plays downfield on the outside and utilize that talent advantage that they have with their wide receivers, that should open things up for the run game and create softer looks to run against. Question number 2, will Dillon Gabriel continue to rise to the occasion? That was kind of the knock on Dillon Gabriel, and it feels like forever ago. It feels, the October of 2023 might as well have been 2010. That's how long ago this feels. But one of the knocks, and going back through my notes against Dillon Gabriel, was that in the big moment, in the big game, he didn't always play his best football. Well, that was put to bed when he went out against Texas as the quarterback for Oklahoma, played about as good as you could possibly play in that upset victory over the Longhorns. And since that time, the bigger the game, the better he seemingly played. Now, the type of rapport that's been created with him and Will Stein, the offensive coordinator, has been amazing. And when the stakes are big, when the stage is significant, you know Will Stein and Dillon Gabriel are going to do a great job of taking advantage of the aggressiveness that you might get from the opposing defense. He did this against Ohio State the first time around, goes for 341 and a couple touchdowns. In the Big Ten championship game against Penn State, he goes for 283 and 4 touchdowns. So the bigger the game, the better he seemingly played. And Ohio State, man, this is a defense that's been amazing all year long. They've allowed at least 20 points in just one game this year. All right. That was obviously against Oregon. To allow just 20 or less in 12 games this year, that's the most in the FBS. But there's one thing about Ohio State is that in games like this, over the last few years, Jim Knowles' defense on a big stage has maybe not always been elite or has not always played really, really well. Oregon game this year, you look at the Michigan game last year, the Georgia game in the Peach Bowl 2 years ago, the Michigan game that year. I mean, there's a handful of games where the defense didn't play great. That has not been the case this season. So I would anticipate a great performance from not just Dillon Gabriel, but I would expect Ohio State's defense to play really well in this game as well. Question number 3, can Ohio State's pass rush have an effect on the Ducks' passing attack? Because the first time around, this was a non-factor. And it just flat out can't be a non-factor again. Now, we know that Oregon's offensive line does a great job. There's no denying that. No one will push back on that. But a matchup that needs to be won by both teams, frankly, is the edges of the defense for Ohio State against the edges of the offense for the Oregon Ducks. These tackles against these defensive ends, whoever wins that matchup is going to have a real chance to find success, whether it's offensively for Oregon or defensively for the Buckeyes. Because in this first matchup, Dillon Gabriel had about as clean a pocket as you could have. They had no sacks. They had 2 quarterback pressures. So he had all day to sit back there and kind of pick apart this Buckeye secondary. As a result, goes for nearly 350, right? The other thing, too, is that when there's no pressure, you have all the time in the world to let your defense or to let your wide receivers run past the defense. How many different completions did they create downfield? How many different touchdowns were created as a result of the deep ball? There were a handful of them. And as we saw against Tennessee, Ohio State has pass rush. Like maybe it's not the Bosa brothers. Maybe it's not Chase Young. But Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, they're rock solid. So they're going to have to overwhelm the opposing quarterback, because if you allow Dillon Gabriel, as accurate as he is, as decisive as he is, as comfortable as he is, if he has all day to pick you apart, he's going to kill you. So Jack Sawyer and Tuimoloau need to play better in this game against the Oregon Ducks. Question 4, what about Oregon's pass rush? They have one of the most disruptive defensive lines in all of college football. Derek Harmon, Jordan Birch, Tuioti, Uiagalelei. I mean, there are 6 or 7 different guys that can potentially win some one-on-ones up front. And we've talked about it already. When Will Howard is under duress, he occasionally makes some poor decisions. This offensive line for Ohio State has been kind of like patchwork throughout the season. Josh Simmons at left tackle. They lost Seth McLaughlin at center. Like, they've lost some key pieces and they've had to shuffle the deck. And I think against Tennessee was the best they've looked all season. Now, part of that was play calling and keeping that Tennessee defensive line guessing and keeping them a little off balance. But part of it was also this offensive line played by far their best game of the year. So if Oregon's pass rush can win against a group that has had some struggles this year, that would go a long way in Oregon being able to slow this group down. Question number 5, who will create more big plays? Now, the first time around, it became a track meet, right? I mean, I remembered a ton of big plays that Oregon created, but I had forgotten about how many Ohio State created in that game. They combined to go for 18 explosive plays in the game. 10-yard rushes or more is considered an explosive play by our standards. 20-plus yard passes are explosive plays as well. Now, one matchup that led to a lot of big plays was Evan Stewart working against Denzel Burke. Denzel Burke gave up a bunch of big plays in this game. Evan Stewart was on the receiving end of many of those. That'll be a matchup that we'll continue to highlight throughout this game as well. But there's a handful of them. I mean, both these teams have incredible weapons. Both these teams have great versatility. Both these teams have great speed and talent at running back. And both of these teams, I think, have quarterbacks that are playing their best football right now. So it could come down to question number 6. Will this game be determined by a key mistake? Oftentimes when teams match up this well, it might come down to a deflected pass. It might come down to a key interception. It might come down to a botched exchange on a zone read as a guy's trying to take it into the end zone. It might come down to a fourth down play that is botched and ultimately leads to a turnover on downs, which could flip momentum, could lead to a kick off the upright. Okay. But most of the time when it comes down to mistakes, it comes down to the quarterback play. Dylan Gabriel's got 6 picks this year. Will Howard's got 9 picks this year, including 2 against Michigan. Will Howard has at times taken some chances with the football that he does not need to take, not in a game like this. Those downfield throws in one-on-one situations, those are pretty safe throws. Outside the numbers, safe throws. He's going to have to be aggressive and accurate on those to avoid some key mistakes by throwing it over the middle. Trends in the game. Oregon, they might be the first AP number 1 ranked team to be an underdog to a team ranked outside the top 5 since 2007. That was the Big 12 championship game where number 1 Missouri was a 3-point underdog against Oklahoma. Oklahoma ended up not just winning that game, but covering as well. Oregon, however, is 4-1 against the spread against teams with winning records this season. They've covered 4 in a row. I will take Ohio State. I think this game's going to be high scoring. I think it's going to be a shootout. I think both teams are elite. Maybe I'm a prisoner of the moment, and that might very well be the case. And if it is, I will 100% eat crow. It has nothing to do with disrespect for Oregon. It has everything to do with the respect I now have for Ohio State and the chip that has now been created for this team on their shoulder. I know you never want to lose to Michigan, but it might have been the best thing for them to refocus this unit, to force the coaching staff to be more aggressive offensively, and to elevate the sense of urgency that you saw that Buckeye defense playing with against the Tennessee Volunteers. I'll take the Buckeyes. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. I think it has a chance to be a shootout. I would expect it to be a classic there in the Rose Bowl. College football playoff quarterfinal at the All-State Sugar Bowl pits the number 2 seeded Georgia Bulldogs against the 7th seeded Irish of Notre Dame. This game will be January 1st, 8:45 Eastern time on ESPN. Right now, Georgia is about a 2-point favorite thereabouts. The total hovers around 43.5. I'm looking forward to being on the call alongside Sean McDonough, Molly McGrath, and Laura Rutledge there in New Orleans. It's going to be amazing. This is the 4th meeting between Georgia and Notre Dame. The Bulldogs are 3-0. All 3 of those wins for Georgia came within the 7-point margin of victory. So these games seemingly have always come down to the wire, and we've seen some classics really not that far removed from a couple classics in the home and home that we saw 6-7 years ago. Notre Dame and Georgia have one common opponent this season. That would be Georgia Tech. Who would have thought, by the way, that we'd be talking about these quarterfinal games on our quarterfinal preview show, and Georgia Tech has a spot here. Fighting Irish handled their business 31-13. That was when Zach Pyron started for Georgia Tech, so you didn't get to see them against Haynes King. But Haynes King was back in action when it went down to an 8-overtime classic between Georgia Tech and Georgia in the final game of the regular season. Georgia, of course, prevailed in that game 44-42. That was really incredible considering the Dogs at one point were down by 17 points. Now, dating back to last year, though, Notre Dame in games like this, they've been great. They have won 7 consecutive games against ranked opponents. But one problem for Notre Dame is that since the BCS was implemented in 1998, Notre Dame is 0-8 in BCS and or New Year's Six bowl games. That's the most losses without a win by any team, including conference championships. So pretty significant that things are working against the Irish historically, but in recent years, they've been great playing against top-tier competition. Let's start with question 1. Is Gunner Stockton ready for prime time? Now, Gunner Stockton will be filling in for the injured Carson Beck. Now, Carson Beck on the final play of what might be his college career, dropping back, drifting left, hit on his arm, hurt his elbow, hated seeing it go down like that. He had a tremendous career. This season was a little bit up and down, but you hate to see him get injured. But what you like to see after the fact is that what was done was done. Carson Beck was out, everyone on Georgia's team seemingly rallied around Gunner Stockton. It was really impressive to watch. And they need to now continue that momentum into their prep and then ultimately into the Sugar Bowl game. Gunner Stockton would be the first quarterback to make his first college start in a playoff game since the format started back in 2014. Now, the fewest starts ever by a quarterback in a college football playoff game was 2. That was Cardale Jones. He made his first start in the Big Ten championship game, and then his second start was against that Alabama team in 2014. That was the Sugar Bowl, ironically enough, and Ohio State went on to win that game and then ultimately beat Oregon for the national championship. But little background on who Gunner Stockton is. I didn't know a whole lot about him. I don't follow recruiting the way a lot of places do, but top 5 dual threat quarterback recruit. He did break Trevor Lawrence's high school record for passing touchdowns in the state of Georgia. That's pretty impressive. And so far, albeit limited work, he's played in 8 games in his career. He's put together 18 rushes for 108 yards. That's excluding sacks. So it does appear like Georgia's offense is probably going to change quite a bit with Gunner Stockton in at the quarterback spot. When he was there in the SEC championship game, they called 6 designed quarterback runs. 5 were done by Gunner Stockton. So think that now in a game in which he's going to play a full half, probably expecting at least 10, 12, 15, maybe 20 designed quarterback runs. That seems aggressive, but probably double digits, more than likely. Now, this is the first time that we saw Georgia utilize quarterback run all season. Now, Carson Beck would take off, but it was mostly in scramble situations. They never, not one time, all season long, called more than 2 designed quarterback runs prior to the SEC championship game. So that is one element too, by the way, that I think benefits Georgia here, is that Notre Dame is going to be preparing for Georgia's offense with their practice regimen. But what is Georgia's offense going to look like? It's a legitimate question. So there is a possibility that Notre Dame in their prep, maybe they're chasing a few ghosts. Because, well, I think they are going to run quarterback power. Oh, I think they'll have quarterback sweep. Oh, I think they're going to run quarterback draw on 2nd and 6. Those are all thinks. Those are not knows. If Carson Beck was the starting quarterback in this game for Georgia, then Notre Dame would know exactly what the offense would look like with him at the helm, considering they have 13 games of tape to study and develop the tendency call sheet for. Question number 2, can Notre Dame run the football? Stats speak for themselves. Top 11 in the country in yards per game with 222. Number 3 in the country in yards per carry at over 6 yards per carry. And they're 3rd in the country in rushing touchdowns with 42. Now, Jeremiah Love is incredible. He's an amazing, amazing back. I said it when we called their game against Indiana. His skill set, if you've never watched him, reminds me an awful lot of Darren McFadden. He's kind of a tall runner. He's got long stride. He runs a little upright, but my goodness, when he gets to the edge, he's out the gate. And he showed that in that 98-yard touchdown run against Indiana. That was the longest play from scrimmage in the college football playoff history, and it's tied for the longest rush in Notre Dame history. Josh Adams had that record back in 2015 against Wake Forest. The problem is, if you look back at that game, the 98 yards was amazing, but they averaged just 2.8 yards per carry on their other 34 carries. 95 yards on 34 carries equates to 2.8. So it wasn't an elite day as far as running the football if you remove the 98-yard touchdown run, but still, how do you remove it? That's what he does. If he gets to the edge and takes it to the house, it is what it is. The guy's amazing. The most impressive thing about this rushing attack, though, is how good they are after contact. Because you can be in the right spot, but it doesn't matter. This team collectively averages nearly 4 yards after contact per carry. That's the 2nd best in college football behind Boise State. Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love both rank in the top 3 in yards after contact per carry. Jadarian Price is 1, Jeremiah Love is 3. I'll give you just a half second to guess who you think is right between those two, sandwiched by Price and Love. That would be correct if you said Ashton Jeanty. Makes sense, right? These two guys really good after contact, just like Jeanty is. But I don't know if many people would know that Price actually leads the country in yards after contact per carry. He actually has over 5 yards per carry after contact. It's pretty amazing. They might have most of their success against Georgia outside the tackles, because this is a Georgia team, especially between the tackles, man. They are big, they are physical, and they really do a great job of just anchoring down in the middle of this defensive line. So if you look at the game against Alabama, you look at the way some other teams have run it against the Dogs this year, a lot of it's probably going to come to the perimeter. Probably a lot of it's going to come outside the tackles. The good news for Notre Dame is that Jeremiah Love, when he gets outside the tackles, which is not often, I might add, he doesn't have some ridiculous amount of carries outside the tackles. That's why this number is probably slightly inflated. He averages 14 yards per carry outside the tackles. So think about that for a moment. Probably should implement a few more perimeter runs for Jeremiah Love, given how efficient he's been on runs like that this year. Now, Georgia's rush defense, it's taken a bit of a step back, if we're going to be honest. Now, between the tackles, like I said, very, very good. But from 2019 to 2022, a couple national championships in there as well, they allowed just 76 rushing yards per game over a 4-year period. Now, in 2023, they were pretty good. They were top 20, but now it's jumped to in the vicinity of like 120, 125 yards a game. It's top 20, like I said, but it's not 76 yards a game. That's where they were for a 4-season span. So it's a group that you can get it against them, but it's likely on the edges and it's likely on the perimeter. Question number 3, will Georgia's front seven overwhelm Notre Dame's offensive line? Now, against the best team that Georgia's faced this year, the front seven's athleticism completely took over the game. That was the Texas Longhorns, and the front seven for Georgia just completely took over the game with movement and shifts and agility and guys just hitting the offensive line at 1,000,000 miles an hour and just blowing things up. Now, they were able to shut down Texas's run game because the pass rush stopped the run en route to the passer. So as a result, those 2 games against Texas, they went for a combined 60 rushing yards. It's the only times the Longhorns were held under 100 rushing yards this year. Now, when you look at when Georgia struggled against, say, Bama and Ole Miss, they struggled to rush the passer in those 2 games. 1/3 of Georgia's sacks this season came in the 2 games against Texas. They have 36 on the year. Against Texas, they had 13. And Mykel Williams and Jalen Walker combined for 8 of those 13. And Jalen Walker is now the proud recipient of the 2024 Butkus Award as the nation's top linebacker. So I think the front seven here for Georgia is going to have to be at their very best in creating disruption and limiting what is a 3-headed rushing attack with Love and Price, and not to mention Riley Leonard, who is also excellent with the ball in his hands. We've already seen Haynes King get loose with a lot of quarterback runs. We've seen Haynes King really hurt Georgia with design quarterback run game. You would anticipate a heavy load from Riley Leonard in the run game as well. Question number 4, can Riley Leonard continue to stay efficient in the passing attack? Now, if you want to rewind back to the Navy game, that was on October 26th. Riley Leonard's really been great throwing the football since that time. He's got 11 touchdowns throwing it, just 3 picks. If you look at the 7 games prior to that Navy game, it wasn't nearly as good. He had 6 touchdowns in those first 7 games. Well, in the last handful, he's got 11 with just 3 picks. So he's been really, really good. He's thrown a touchdown in all 6 games during this stretch. He's completing 75% of his passes over the last 3 weeks. And while it hasn't been as much about the downfield throws, most of what he does is at or around the line of scrimmage. He averages about 7.2 yards downfield per attempt. That's 110th out of 127. And against Indiana, the most recent game, he had just 1 throw that traveled more than 10 yards downfield. And that was a big post to Jordan Faison as Riley Leonard was stepping up in the pocket. That was the one time they tried it downfield. Now, they called more plays to go downfield. They called a few shots in the game, but he was very comfortable taking the check down because that's what the team needed to be successful. He's been really efficient. He's made great decisions. Another thing he's done too is he started to really attack the blitz, which I really appreciate. Against Indiana's pass rush, when Indiana brought some heat, Riley Leonard seemingly always had an answer. So far this year against the blitz, Riley Leonard is 11-1 touchdown interception ratio. Well, Georgia, they're going to heat you up. They're not afraid to call pressure. They're not afraid to bring guys from the second level. They've called blitzes on 35% of the opponent's dropbacks that they faced this year. That's top 15 or 16 in the country. When they do bring a lot of pressure, though, they're getting home about 50% of the time. I mean, that's pretty impressive. So when they blitz, they're getting guys home and forcing the quarterback to make quick decisions. And they're probably going to be pretty aggressive in this game. Because if you look at how Georgia's played, they've allowed at least 9 explosive plays, 10-yard run, 20-yard passes in 3 of their last 5 games. So I would think that they're probably going to be a little bit more aggressive because this has not been a Notre Dame team that's willing to take a lot of shots downfield. So I think Georgia will kind of squat on things underneath. I think they'll blitz. I think they'll try to force it out of Riley Leonard's hands quickly, and they'll force him to make great decisions with extra guys in his face. Question number 5, can Georgia find some balance offensively? And this might help with moving to Gunner Stockton, a guy that as a quarterback is a little more capable with his legs. Because right now, Georgia's running the ball in 39% of their offensive snaps. That's 116th in the FBS. Now, this is a huge deviation from what Kirby Smart has traditionally been. He got the job in 2016, and in the first 7 or 8 years of his tenure, from 2016 to 2023, they were running it on about 53% of their offensive snaps. Well, to go from 53% in the first 8 years to now 39%, that's a pretty significant drop. And if you look at the passing game, it's not like it's the most efficient, and it's not like it's, the air raid. All right. Most of their stuff's really high percentage, kind of extended handoffs type of plays, but a lot of it is based on getting the ball out really quickly. I mean, nearly a third of their passing attempts come at or behind the line of scrimmage. That's among the highest in the FBS. And drops have been a problem too. They lead the FBS in drops. So they have to stay efficient throwing the football, but they might want to open things up off play action a little bit more if they can get the run game going. And then question number 6, can Notre Dame apply some pressure defensively? Big note in this game are the injuries for Notre Dame. Boubacar Traore, they lost him earlier in the year. They lost Botello early in the year, another edge rusher. And now they've lost Riley Mills, who got hurt, unfortunately, the defensive tackle against Indiana after leg whipping his own guy. So they're going to have to create some pressure. Howard Cross is back. He's a defensive tackle that's really disruptive along the front. And Notre Dame, they don't blitz some crazy amount. They're about 30% of the time. That's top 40 in the country. But last year, they were a team that blitzed nearly half the time. So they were at 46, 47% last year in blitz. This year, that number's dropped off considerably, but you haven't seen the pressure rate totally drop off, but it might need to step up here in this game with some simulated pressures, bringing guys, and then dropping defensive ends out, because I'm not sure outside of Howard Cross who the guy is going to be that's going to be able to create his own shot. It might be Bryce Love. It might be him, but at this point, or Bryce Young, not Bryce Love, the former Stanford running back, Bryce Young, the 6'7" true freshman that is wreaking havoc on opposing tackles as a young 18-year-old. So Bryce Young might be the guy, but it's to be determined who's going to step up in Riley Mills' absence, because that is a significant one. This has been a defense that has had some issues from an injury standpoint this year. Just hope it doesn't catch up with them here as they move forward in the postseason. The reason why pressure is so significant, this is a Gunner Stockton. His first career start, he was blitzed on just 4 dropbacks in the SEC championship game. All right, he was sacked once. He had 1 completion in those 4 dropbacks, and it went for -2 yards. He also threw an interception. So he has not handled pressure well, albeit super small sample size of just 4 dropbacks against blitz. But I would think that number is probably going to go up a little bit when you face the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. Really low total in the game, couple trends. 43.5 is a really low total. You have to wonder how much of that has to do with the respect that most people have for the defenses on both sides, and how much of that has to do with the backup quarterback stepping in for an injured Carson Beck. Huge question in the game. But, man, it's going to be awesome. I will not make a pick in this game, but I will be on the call alongside Sean McDonough, Molly McGrath, and Laura Rutledge from New Orleans at 8:45 Eastern on January 1st. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. We appreciate all of you that have supported us throughout the holiday season. We hope that if you are traveling all over the country, like several of you are, we hope that you're downloading the podcast wherever you get the podcast. If you could, though, while you're there, leave us a rating, leave us a review. The numbers have been off the charts good, and the support that you've shown the show this season has been incredible. We very much appreciate the support that you've shown us here, not just on the podcast platform, but also on the ESPN College Football YouTube page. We will be back. We will break down these quarterfinal matchups. We will walk you through them, some takeaways, all that stuff here on the day after the games. We'll have that for you, but we also will help set the table for the semis, for the national championship, and a few other bowl games that we have to look forward to along the way. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football.